Hey, Matt Knibb, where's the guest?
Right, Brad Smith. No guest this week. We've gained a lot of new followers recently, or new listeners, whatever you call it when it's in podcast world. And our podcast doesn't quite meet the same format that loads of other podcasts use. So we have a slightly different format, mainly because we kind of just made it up ourselves. But we thought it'd be...
It's a good one.
It is a good one. It's a very good one. And we thought it'd be quite useful to explain to our new listeners, new followers, whoever you are, the way that our podcast works. So that's what I thought we'd do today in our podcast about a podcast. And I thought we'd start by explaining actually what you and I are. Not to each other, not our personal relationship. That stays off air and top secret. But actually, because it's a point of difference between our male mental health podcast and other male mental health podcasts. So do you want to explain what actually you are, and then I'll explain what I am?
Yeah, so I am a solution-focused hypnotherapist.
What on earth is that, Brad?
Is part of my job. Well, that's a good question. So as a hypnotherapist, it is a form of talking therapy, and it's a type of therapy that I was really drawn to because I've always been fascinated about mindset and the power of positivity, and that's what hypnotherapy really focuses on. And I enjoy it because it's about looking forwards. It's not about kind of looking back at the past. It's about looking forwards and embracing the now and seeing everything in that positive light. And so I was really drawn to that. And I think it kind of appeals to lots of men because very often we don't want to go back into the past and explore things that have gone on. Now, that's not to say that that's not important by any means, but it is a really, really positive type of talking therapy. And it's great. And I work with people with all sorts of different conditions that come to see me. So anxiety, depression, OCD. I work with sports performers to improve their performance, obviously. All sorts of different things. Weight loss, stopping smoking and vaping. And it's all centered around understanding the brain and moving from one part of our brain, which can be less helpful in the modern world, which I would refer to as our primitive mind, into our intellectual mind, where we make good decisions and we see things in a much more positive light. So that's what hypnotherapy is kind of all about. And then the other part to my job, like you, I work in a school, and I work in a specialist school, an alternative provision. And my role there is to explore lots of other mainstream settings and try and support young people that might be finding it difficult to cope in that environment.
I mean,
and that might be because...
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's important because more and more we're realising there is a need to support, in the need to support male mental health, there's a real need to support boys' mental health as well. And actually, you and I both being trained and qualified teachers, I think really puts us in a good position to comment on youth mental health as well. Sorry, carry on.
I have my two hats. I have my teaching hat and I have my hypnotherapy hat, and I love both. So that's me.
Days.
How about you? Tell the listeners what you do.
I'm so glad you asked. So I am a mental health first aid instructor, and just like you, Bradley, with your niche just really fitting with you and working for you, mental health first aid just sits so nicely with me. So what it is it's just like physical first aid, in that a physical first aider would not think of themselves as qualified to be x-raying someone or overseeing their cancer treatment through to the full stage of recovery. Mental health first aid is like physical first aid in terms of it qualifies you to recognise when something's not quite right, to be able to look after that person in the initial instance, and then to know where to direct that person to for appropriate professional help. So they almost talk about mental health first aid as taking mental health a little bit out of the hands of psychologists and psychotherapists and counsellors, because you don't always need somebody at that level for a mental health issue. You might need a little bit of basic care, and actually one of the main things we teach, surprisingly for you because I interrupt and butt in all the time on the podcast, but one of the
True story, people.
One of the main things that we teach is how to really listen to people and how to actively listen and how to show people you're actively listening. And so you don't get that normal me, then you, then me, then you flow of a conversation. You tend to get that, right, I'm trying to get information out of you, and I'm trying to show you that actually this isn't about me sharing my experiences. This is about me just allowing you more and more room for you to talk and for you to share, but for you to feel listened to at the same time. So I deliver those courses for adults to look after other adults. That's the adult course. And for adults to look after young people for their mental health. And yeah, it suits me down to the ground, because I also really believe in that early intervention approach of I'm so far down the road of like, don't just hold on to your crap, like unburden yourself, let it go. I've been that guy, and I imagine loads of our male listeners will have been that guy who've been like, bottle it up, bottle it up, bottle it up, put it on your shoulders, and more and more and more. Yeah, exactly. Hands up. I bet there's hands going up everywhere. Where it gets to the point where you feel like there's too much. There's too much on my shoulders to let any of it go. Because if I let any of it go, there's going to be a landslide, and it's going to be a crisis, and things are going to be awful. So now that I've shed that, I'm such a strong advocate for that idea. If you've got a little something on your shoulder, share it, offload it now. A little something on your shoulder, share it, offload it now. Before you get to the stage where you need a psychotherapist or a psychologist or a counsellor. And not to say that those people are not worthwhile. They are incredible. But the idea is you try to prevent yourself getting to the stage where you would need that level of help.
Sounds like two co-hosts of a wonderful podcast that are also qualified, entertaining, and informative.
Well, like, this is one thing. Like, we'll get to the meat of the subject in a minute. But I found that some male mental health podcasts were with Dr. Professor Know-It-All, who was so dry and so dull and so serious that I just felt switched off, and I just felt like I want to know what this guy's talking about and the title of the show. I'm interested in whatever that might be, but my God, this guy is rah, 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 rah. So we're not that. We are qualified to have conversations about mental health, but we're trying not to do it in that hyper highbrow, overeducated approach. But likewise, and again, I'm trying not to throw shade, but there are other male mental health podcasts where the hosts are unqualified entirely. And they're just like, what? Fucking hell, mate. I don't know what you want to do, bruv. But what you want to do, couple of beers, mate, and then you'll be all right, brother. Like, I've listened, I'm not going to mention who it is, but bloody hell. Like, the hosts do not know what they're talking about. And sometimes I worry that they might be doing more harm than good. So we're trying to put ourselves in that middle ground of fun and engaging, but also qualified and knowledgeable.
Cool. Well, how about we get into it, and we start to explain a little bit about kind of our thinking outside of the box when we came up with the idea for our show. So I'm going to kick off with a question for you, and I want to know, why is it, Nibbo, that we always talk to guests about their takeaway choices? What has that got to do with mental health?
Okay, so first round is always, if you're going to have a takeaway tonight or any other night, what would you go for? The glib answer is just a cheeky play on words so that we can end up with a takeaway, in inverted commas, at the end of the show. But that's not actually it. I find when you want to initiate a conversation with someone unfamiliar, then that can be really difficult to do. And actually, if you pick a subject like takeaways, that's a subject that everybody loves talking about, and nobody, as far as in my experience, nobody really clams up when they're talking about takeaways. People are quite easy and quite willing to get relaxed and loose in that conversation quite early on. So the kind of example we're trying to give to people is that idea that, like, you want to have a mental health conversation with someone, or you want someone to feel as if they could have a mental health conversation with you. Now, like, complete proviso, and I don't mean just through me, if you really want to have a serious mental health conversation with someone, get qualified to do it, do a mental health first aid course. I'm not saying that so that I make money, because you could do that through anyone. There's loads of mental health first aid courses. MHFA England ones, though, because they're the only ones that are actually entirely evidence-based. There you go, that's my little plug. But so, yeah, if you want to have a proper, or if you find yourself always wanting to have mental health conversations with people, then, yeah, get trained to have those conversations. But we can have mental health conversations just in daily discourse. That can just be part of normal conversation. That idea that it's dangerous or banned or somehow unhealthy is wrong, and it just contributes to the stigma. So if there's someone unfamiliar in your surroundings, but you'd like to initiate a conversation with them in order to build towards discussing their mental health, talking about takeaways is such an easy entry, but also it involves loads of the factors that affect people's mental health, the main factors that affect people's mental health. So if I go through the societal factors, and you tell me if you think any of these could come up in a conversation around takeaways. So the societal factors are poverty, unemployment, poor education, poor housing, community violence, inequality, stigma, and discrimination. Now, immediately to me, I'm thinking if I'm asking someone about their takeaway choices, the whole poverty, unemployment, that's going to come up. That idea of, well, we haven't got much money, or we have a takeaway once every 6 months because we can't really afford it. I think you're going to be able to weave those factors into a conversation about takeaways. On top of that, the individual factors that affect mental health. Tell me if you think any of these actually could come into a conversation about takeaways. So alcohol, drugs, smoking, abuse, stress. We've definitely had guests on the show who've said, like, man, when I'm stressed, we go for a takeaway and start to try to alleviate some of that stress by not cooking and not washing up tonight. Traumatic life events may be less likely. Prison, poor parenting, absolutely. If someone's a young carer and actually their parents aren't able to provide food at home, they may live on takeaways. Lack of support, illness, disability, genetics. Also, you get things in there like religion and ethical beliefs around veganism. And we've definitely had some vegans on that were not very good vegans. And then we've got things like community engagement and physical health. These are massive factors that affect mental health. So tolerant community, meaningful activity, social network, stable home, housing environment, physical activity, nutrition, rest and reflection. Like, I think our listeners will be able to hear those and think that if those are the factors that affect mental health, I could ask someone about their takeaway choices and I could start to weave in questions around those factors that affect mental health. What do you reckon?
So what you're saying is we start off talking about takeaways, and then you alluded to at the end that there are some takeaways that listeners can have off the back of that. I mean that's genius. What a genius concept that is.
We're almost too clever for our own good.
It's so true. And I think when we started off this podcast, we kind of went into it with this view that men aren't very good at talking. And therefore, we wanted to contribute towards challenging that problem. But what we very, very quickly realised is that men are great at talking.
Yes.
We just need the right environment to talk. And that's where our approach of talking about the takeaways, but also having that kind of light-hearted, jovial, a bit of a laugh, all works towards creating that environment for men to begin to talk. And what all of our guests have found so far is that actually it's really easy. I think not once has a guest left and gone, oh, I felt a bit uncomfortable with that.
Yeah.
Actually, they've all really enjoyed the conversation. You know, they felt positive about the conversation. And that's what is helping, really. And so people who come on the show and model how to have those conversations with us help those people that maybe aren't quite ready to start those conversations just yet, and maybe listening to those and hearing how those conversations might help them to open up, but it might also support somebody who wants to help somebody, which is what you're alluding to as well. That actually if I hear it and I know I've got a mate struggling, or a sibling or a parent or a child or whoever, I can start to think, okay, well, maybe just asking them, how are you, is not going to elicit the sort of response that I want. And I think that's what is so important. I can think of 2 occasions today where somebody said to me, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And I was like, "Yep, no, I'm all right." And knowing full well that actually, no, I'm juggling quite a lot at the minute, and things are pretty tricky. But I'm not going to give you that information. So yeah, I love talking about takeaways. It's always interesting. It does give it a real insight into different people and their views and why they choose the things that they choose. And ultimately, it's a bit of fun. So it's a great segue in. So I love it when we kick off with our takeaway chat.
And I can't ignore that. So someone asks you today, or 2 people ask you today, "Hi, how are you?" And I think we probably know that they probably didn't really mean, "Tell me everything that's going on with you."
No, absolutely not. No.
But if they had of been able to create the conditions that we know would have enabled you to feel able to talk and able to share what's going on with you, if they'd created those conditions and created an environment where you felt safe to talk about what's going on with you, having had that opportunity to talk about what's going on with you, would you feel better? Would it improve how you're feeling?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And I think that's the benefit that we have on the show and modeling all of these conversations is that we have found a way where actually it works and
Yes.
men are prepared to come on and open up. And so that is demonstrated. So we're demonstrating how to engage in those conversations, but also the great guests that we've got coming on the show are demonstrating actually, yeah, this is actually okay to talk about it. And it's positive and I feel good about it. So
It's mad, isn't
it's
it?
win-win,
It's
really.
mad that
It's win-win.
there's so much thought around. Oh, it's so difficult. It's so hard to talk about your feelings and your thoughts and emotions. And people come on the show, and everyone that's been on the show has finished it with like, "Thanks, lads, that was great. Really enjoyed that."
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
who says it's hard? Creating the right conditions is technical, and you've got to have a bit of an idea about what you're doing there. And I think we've got that idea about how we create those conditions. I do think I'm building a website at the moment, and I do think as one of the services I offer might be like a 3-hour workshop on how to create the conditions for your man, whether it's husband, father, brother, uncle, whoever, but for the man, how to create the conditions for the man in your life to talk about his mental health, because we're working that out. And one like slight side issue, it's totally the opposite to physical medicine. Physical medicine, loads of physical medicine is tested only on men because it's cheaper. Because men's hormonal cycle is a lot more stable, and therefore the results are a lot more predictable and a lot more able to extrapolate those results based on your sample. Loads of medicines are only tested on men, and so it's far more of a mystery about how those medicines actually affect women. The opposite of that is true with mental health in terms of, certainly in this country, the mental health system that we have is designed around, naturally, the people that have reported poor mental health. Well, up until now, those people that have reported poor mental health have been women. And so the interventions and the common assumptions about how you look after somebody who's struggling with their mental health, that's all based on women struggling with their mental health. And what we're realizing now is actually what is good for a woman experiencing poor mental health is not the same as what's good for a guy experiencing poor mental health. But actually, we're really starting to unlock those secrets of what does a guy need to actually start to open up and start to talk about his mental health. And a lot of the time, chips is part of the answer.
Cool. So people can check that out and in the show, can't they? So my next question is this. After we've had some takeaway chats, we generally ask would you rather questions. What's that all about?
Bradley. So if the first question is how to initiate a conversation with someone that's unfamiliar to you, I think the would you rathers are good examples of how you might initiate conversations, or how you might initiate conversations with someone who is familiar with you, or you might carry on that conversation with someone that was unfamiliar. You've talked about takeaways. You go into would you rathers because You can make would you rathers as fun as you want. So I've got one for you. I've got two absolute belters for you, just as examples. I know I didn't prep you for this, but
You didn't know.
one of them you've thought of before because we've discussed it, but we'll talk about that in a sec. Would you rather spend an entire day with soaking wet socks? So from it's got to be a normal length day, okay?
Okay.
And you can't dry them, and you can't be like they will dry over the course of the day. They stay wet for the whole day, or
Okay.
know that you've got the same single pair of pants for a week. And listeners, by the way, we'll bring this round to mental health, don't worry.
Yeah, I see. Now, I don't think... So the socks is only a day?
It's only a day, but they're soaking wet for the whole day.
Pants is for a week?
Yeah.
Yeah. See, I've got a bit of an issue with... I hate the idea of... I sometimes see it at the beach. Like, people that are, like, fully clothed in the sea. And I'm like... Oh,
What are you doing?
That's horrible.
What are those people doing?
That's a horrible feeling. And in fact, I think I can remember like nightmares as a kid of being like clothed but soaking wet.
I've seen it too.
Horrible.
I don't know what those people are doing.
No, that's it. And do you know what else? Do you know what else grinds my gears, Nibbo? And I'm gonna see it in the summer.
Having to
right?
change pants every day.
I don't get it. I don't get this, right? When I'm at the beach, enjoying the sunshine, enjoying maybe the surf or just generally playing around, there's people that wear socks on the beach. What is wrong with you people wearing socks? And they go in the sea and get their socks wet. And then like all the sand sticks to it. And I think, what's going on there? That to me is unheard of.
Brad, none of this is telling me whether you want to wear soaking wet socks for a day or the same pair of pants for a week.
Now, for me, I think the pants would be okay. As long as you're not like, you're doing hard like training sessions in the gym or something, you're getting proper sweaty. That's a different ball game. But if it's just like a typical week where you're not doing that much and, I can shower and I can be clean, I can go in the sea, I'm not worried about wearing the same pants for a week. It's not that big a deal. But soaking wet socks all day. Your feet would be in bits at the end of that. They would. The skin on your feet would be in bits. Probably that would last a week. So I'm taking the pants. And let's face it, you can turn them inside out halfway through the week.
But you can do inside out, where you can do normal, then you can do inside out, then you can do inside out back to front, then you can do normal back to front. And so that's 4 days.
No, you can't wear them back to front because then they're all saggy around the front and chafy around the back.
My pants are all saggy around the front anyway. Is that not how it's supposed to be? Hey, funny. Right, so we've had a silly would you rather question, right? The way we use those is we kind of butt our guests up a little bit with a silly would you rather question, like the one we've just had there. And then once you're in that pattern of having would you rather questions, you can start to get round to the stuff that you want to get round to. So, for example, if you suspect the person you're talking to is experiencing depression, you might ask them, without saying to them, you have depression, without saying that, you could ask them, would you rather, and then ask a question about feel sad for 2 weeks, and then put an alternative in about feel worried for 2 weeks, or feel nervous for 2 weeks. And so you're not necessarily talking about that person's mental health, you're just talking about mental health as a broad picture. You're starting to bring that mental health terminology into the conversation without explicitly saying, tell me how you feel. Because tell me how you feel, I think, is such a hard question to answer, and it's such a confronting question to answer. Whereas we're trying to be just a tiny bit more charming and just a tiny bit more gentle with our approach of, I'm not saying, tell me about what it feels like when you are depressed. What I mean is, or what we're doing is saying, like, would you rather feel sad for 2 weeks or like horrendously worried for 2 days. And then you're getting that person to start engaging in a conversation that if they do have experience of either of those, they're probably going to bring that experience into that conversation and they may well start to say, actually, there was a time not long ago where I really felt sad for quite a while, and I would never want to experience that again, so I'll choose the other one. So you're starting to bring those other elements of mental health language into the conversation.
And I think what it also opens up for our guests, and we always say to our guests, don't we, that, you know, you've got full right to talk about whatever it is you want to talk about, and also withhold whatever you want to withhold. So it takes that pressure away. And I think the would you rathers are a great way, like you say, of just softly working towards the conversation. But what we usually find is that actually people are really happy to talk about it.
Yeah.
They're happy to think about it, whether it's as like a third party or whether it's about them as an individual. They're quite happy to talk about it. They're quite comfortable to talk about it. And even when we talk about sometimes negative aspects, because we're quite conscious to focus on the positive and the negative kind of emotions and feelings. But even when we pick up on the negative stuff, we can still have a laugh along the way. And I think that is something that is important that we bring. And there's definitely been points in episodes gone by where, you know, sometimes we've been on quite a profound point and then somebody makes a joke or something like that. And it acts as, when we described it in one episode, it's that pressure release valve. It's that, okay, I've shared it. I might feel a little bit vulnerable. Oh, thank God there's a bit of laughter and a bit of... We've kind of diffused it, and actually it feels okay again. Next, would you rather?
Which is
so I love...
Sorry, I'm interrupting. But that's the nature of the conversation that men have naturally anyway. And that needs to be a characteristic of male mental health conversations. It's no good having... This is what a mental health conversation looks like, and men have got to get used to that. When actually, over here, men have got their own form of communication and their own style of conversation. And actually, what I think we need to do is drag mental health into that conversation and into those styles of conversation, rather than just telling men, in particular, telling men who are experiencing mental ill health, you've got to get used to talking like this. Because I think that's bullshit. I think it's far more sensible to take that mental health element and pull it into the conversations that men are having anyway, so we can carry on having our conversations in our way, but they include mental health now because of the unique approach of the mental health takeaways.
And one of the key sort of concepts for us was that we wanted the show to be natural and we wanted the show to be authentic. And we feel that the format gives us that, because actually our guests can take it in whatever direction they want to go. And whilst we kind of have our sort of format that we loosely stick to on all episodes, the way in which that goes is really dependent on the guest, and that's what makes each episode so interesting and so diverse. It doesn't matter that we always start off with takeaways and then we move into would you rathers, because the responses are always so different. So love the would you rathers, always love the silly one to kick things off and lighten the mood.
Well, there's also the whole shit sandwich approach. We start off with the funny would you rather, or often we start off with the funny would you rather, although we do kind of judge it and balance it as we go through, because sometimes we think, right, maybe the second would you rather that we've got written down would actually cut straight into this guy's story, so let's maybe go with that first. But we tried to go funny, serious, to really get into the meat of the reason that guest is on, and then finish on a positive as well. Because we probably, as a virtue of being teachers and having been told that never give a kid bad news of like, you are fucking horrific at badminton. Like, make it a shit sandwich. You're like, hey, you have got your trainers on the right feet today, but you're fucking horrific at badminton, but you packed your kit nicely. So, like, you know, try to sandwich the bad news in between two bits of good news.
And a really good example of a genuine, authentic man sharing a real life story from his past. Well done, you.
I can play badminton. I shall have you know.
Oh, yes. It's the shoes you can't get on the right feet, isn't it? Anyway, let's move on. because once we've been through our would you rathers, as we approach kind of the second part of the show, we always ask guests. We always ask guests, what would they ask, or what advice would they give their 8-year-old self, knowing now what they know? So why do we ask that question?
So I almost feel like we should start to make sure that guests know they're going to get asked that question, because I think when you know you're going to be asked that question, you might prepare a slightly more thorough answer. So we get a lot of like instantaneous reaction answers to that. Of one guy, Giles, I really loved how impassioned he was in his answer, because there was clearly a deep story there. Of he just said in quite a sort of low, gruff way that he would tell his 8-year-old self to tell all your teachers to fuck off. They've got you wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. And I thought, like, there's clearly a lot of strong feeling there, and thoughts, feelings, and emotions. That's our mental health. So we're dragging mental health. But I feel like if guests knew they were going to get asked that question, they might spend a while just mentally reconnecting with their 8-year-old self on a slightly deeper level. And the reason I say that is because, again, one of the things that we're discovering as we carry on this journey, a lot of men don't feel like they still are that same person that was 8. They feel detached from their youth so much that almost they feel like that was a different person. Like I sometimes, in fact, I did today. Today I talked about myself when I was 21 and I worked in a bar, and I described it as being another lifetime. Like it feels like a different lifetime altogether when I was like that kid behind the bar throwing bottles around and shit like that. But it wasn't a different lifetime. It was me. And what I think some of our guests might benefit from would be that idea of really reconnecting with their younger self. For our for the benefit of our listeners now, there is a practice called inner child work. And inner child work is really about giving yourself what you needed as a child, but being the one to give it to yourself now. You couldn't give it to yourself when you were a child. You relied on other people, usually parents, to give it to you, and it wasn't forthcoming. But that's normal and natural, because no parent is perfect. I'm a parent, not perfect, a long way from being perfect. So there'll be things that we missed out on in our childhood, our kids will miss out on in their childhood. Try as we might, you can just never cover all the bases. And when you initiate inner child work, you really reconnect with that young person, in our case, young boy, young man, inside you, and you really try to work out what was it that was absent for that young man that I can backfill and I can give back to that young man now. And one of the ways that you can do that is to get a photograph of yourself at a particular age. We always use 8-year-olds because it's sort of nice and symmetrical, because we use 80-year-olds on the other side of the questions. But if you could get a picture of yourself as an 8-year-old, if you could talk to people that knew you as an 8-year-old, and possibly even write that 8-year-old a letter, or maybe just have a conversation in your head about really trying to connect with that younger version of yourself and trying to give that younger version whatever it was that they were missing, so that they're more able to tackle the future that you know is going to come to them. And it's such a powerful exercise to reconnect with the younger version of yourself.
Yeah, and I think it ties into that kind of empathetic listening, really. And I think that's partly what we do in the show. We kind of model that listening and that empathy, because we know men, we're not typically looking for a quick fix. Actually, it's just about being heard and somebody sitting and listening. And that empathetic listening is really important. And it's sometimes something that we need to do as adults. And a lot of the trauma work that I do as a sort of trauma-informed and mental health practitioner is sometimes around that empathetic listening, where we replace emotion with emotion, because that's one way to kind of deal with trauma. And so it might not be that somebody has been through a traumatic experienced when they were that age. Some of our guests have, but not all of them. But we can often have feelings, and we can remember maybe not being as confident or something like that when we're younger. And I think often when guests are encouraged to think back to that and the advice that they would give, they realize how far they've
Yes.
come in that journey, and therefore it replaces that emotion where actually it was led a little bit by maybe some feelings of not quite being adequate enough or not fulfilling certain things, with a sense of pride maybe that then replaces that. And so I think that's where that connection with our younger selves can be really important.
Something that I heard that relates to that makes so much sense now that I think about it, because on my degree I almost feel like saying majored in, but I'm not an American. My dissertation was in sports psychology, and my passion was in sports psychology, and probably if I'd have had the funds I'd have stayed on and done a master's in sports psychology, but then I never would have met you and the podcast wouldn't exist. So it's for the best that I didn't. However, this idea that our trauma responses are usually developed when we're young, and that if there is something that we find traumatic, it doesn't have to be actual real trauma, it just has to be something that we found traumatic as a young person. What our response was to that got us through it, and got us through it safely. And so it's really no surprise at all that when we find the next thing traumatic, we revert back to that trauma response that got us through it the first time round. I mentioned sports psychology because that whole idea of when you're at a state of high arousal in a sports match, let's say you're playing rugby, you're one-on-one with someone, and you're sort of state of high arousal, so like you kind of got that attention narrowing thing going on. What your brain leaps to is what worked last time, and I'll do that again, and what worked last time, and I'll do that again. And actually, but then you just become predictable and you become a bad player. So it's about trying to learn other things that you can do in that moment. What we don't realize, and I'll mention something that I bet will chime with so many men in a minute. What I think we don't realize is that we formed that trauma response as a young person, brackets immature person, and I don't mean like immature for your age, I just mean that like an 8-year-old is immature because they're 8. So we formed that trauma response as an immature person. We have different tools and different abilities and different knowledge and different skills now. I'm the grand old age of 45, would you believe? I know I look far younger. But we have a totally different range of skills and abilities now, but we're still reverting to that same trauma response that was formed as an 8-year-old, unless we consciously unpick it, unless we choose to realize that's the thing I did as an 8-year-old that got me through, but I can do different stuff now, because although I'm the same person, I've got a different set of skills and abilities that can help me through that. And the thing that I don't know, I don't think I've spoken to you about this in particular, but loads of men, and myself included, so we'll go back a little bit. My dad was quite a strong and domineering character, which had pros and cons. But like when he got in a bad mood, and he would get in bad moods, I knew you stay quiet. You just stay quiet. You stay out the way. You shrink. You get small. Like you leave him to do whatever he's doing that's putting him in a bad mood, and you stay the fuck out of the way. And I recognise in my relationships since then that when ill feeling or bad mood was coming to the fore, my default position was to just stay quiet, just try to sort of weather it, or like get through it without triggering anything, without pissing anyone off, without stirring the pot at all. But that was a trauma response from me. For some people, for some men in particular, so some men really go into their shell, and the more their partner asks, what's wrong, what's wrong, what's wrong, the more they want to be in their shell and just let it pass and just let it go. But that's that got them through safely at that time of trauma, so they're reverting back to it now. Some men lashed out when they were 8, 9, and actually it got them through it safely, so they lash out now. But it's still just the same trauma response that they formed when they were younger, and actually now they have access to different responses if they consciously unpick them.
Yeah, and I think that really highlights what a kind of positive environment we create on the podcast is, because you constantly fucking interrupt. At no point do you shy away and think, I just got to be quiet and let Brad do what he's doing. He's the star of the show. You just keep
Star of the
interrupting. So we've
show.
obviously got that lovely safe culture. But it's true, and a trauma response is entirely appropriate to a traumatic situation. The trouble is, often we carry it with us for long periods of time afterwards, and that's because the part of our brain that you're alluding to there is our hippocampus. That's where all our previously learned patterns of behavior get stored, and it's one of the things I love about my hypnotherapy work, because it's about changing those patterns of behavior and creating new, much better ones. Yeah, great. So I think that really kind of handles the 8-year-old. But then we go on to talk about an 80-year-old, and we give people 1 minute, because we're only doing short
Yes.
bursts with this, aren't we? To ask 80-year-old them, usually, for the most part, what would they ask? So what's the thinking behind that?
So the thinking behind it being 1 minute is that it's not a therapy session; it is a conversation. But it's that the 80-year or the older version of yourself, the 80-year-old version of yourself. Again, factors that affect mental health, and some of those are inherent genetic factors that aren't changeable, but lots of them are around our lifestyle choices and what we choose to do with our life and how that affects our mental health. And what we've realized is if we want our 80-year-old self to be living in a particular way, because we get people to imagine that person as well, like the guys we've had on that have worked in the fitness industry, we're like, is he still working out? Is he still active? And like, yeah, of course he is. He's doing a cartwheel on his way into the room. So imagining your 80-year-old self, it starts to get you thinking about, what do I need to actually do now to make that 80-year-old version of me a reality? And like, without going into too much detail, I'll end up in trouble again. I absolutely remember I think I've mentioned it on the show before. I think it was during COVID, and I'd heard, I think it was on Radio 1, I think it was Scott Mills, was talking about the idea of writing letters to your younger self, but also writing letters to your older self. So I got my phone, took a picture of myself, and it was just of my face, steady, and use one of those apps where you can age yourself. And I was able to effectively look into the future and see the older version of me. I think it was like retirement age, 65. But I would recommend our listeners do this. Use those, you get a free trial with loads of them. So you use the free trial, take a picture of yourself, age yourself, and then think, what life do I want this guy to be living? And I remember thinking, when I was looking at my older self, I do not want to be married to the person that I'm married to now when I'm this age. And if he is going to live a different life, if he's going to live a life which has got the factors he needs to be happy, I need to make those changes. I need to do that now. And that led to it indirectly led to my divorce and led to me living the life I live now, where I'm infinitely happier. No shade being thrown at my ex at all. It's just that in terms of being compatible for happiness, we weren't it. So really, the purpose of asking about our 80-year-old selves is really asking, like, what do you need to do now to safeguard your mental health for the future? Because whatever that is, you need to start doing it now. So yeah, that's why we ask that.
Cool. So we've got takeaway chat, we've got would you rather, we've got 8-year-old self, we've got 80-year-old self, and then we finish up going full circle with a very cleverly titled Mental Health Takeaways podcast. We finish up on takeaways. Why do we finish up on takeaways?
Just think men far prefer the idea of there's a clear plan of what to do next. There is a massive benefit in feeling listened to and feeling observed and seen, and that is part of the mental health jigsaw. But I really feel like men like to know, what should I be doing next? In fact, it's one of the things that I massively benefited from your solution-focused hypnotherapy of, like, this week, Matt, what are you actually going to do to reduce your stress between now and the next time we have a session. And we would make a plan, and having that plan, knowing this is that thing that I need to do, really focused me on actually doing that thing. And when it comes to our podcast, finishing on those takeaways of this is the thing that I've learned from this conversation. If it's one little mindset hack, or if it's an actual practice, a thing to go and do, this is the thing that I've got from this conversation. I'm going to take that away, and I can implement it tomorrow. We got the idea from both being teachers and teacher training. And I've been on teacher training that has given me this massive philosophical concept that you could apply over the next 10 years and start to see blah, 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 blah. And I was bored by the time I got to the end of the explanation. Whereas the most effective teacher training I ever have been on are things like where they go, on an interactive whiteboard, if you press this and that, you get this. And it's fucking amazing. And oh, amazing. I can use that tomorrow. I can still remember we had a session called iPads in an Hour, when these, like a laptop screen with no keyboard, like a massive phone, these iPads were first being introduced into education. We had a session.
Never heard of them.
They were remarkable at the time. iPad. Everyone was making the joke of iPad and covering one eye. No, it's not that. But I can remember the iPad in an Hour session that I did, and the guy showed us something called Bust a Move on the iPad, where if you haven't been using it in PE, you should be. It was basically just a delay. The screen would show what the camera saw, and you could set the delay up to 2 minutes, and it could just run constantly. So, for example, something like long jump, you could just set the iPad up. Someone could run along, jump, get out the pit, walk around, see their own long jump on the iPad screen, do their own fault correction, and go and line up again. And it's those kind of takeaways. This is the thing to do next. This is the clear plan. That's what we're trying to give people, rather than too much of a complicated concept. We just want clear, that's what you should go and do. Go and do that.
I think one of the things I love about the takeaways and sort of section as well, because I think people shut down when you tell them what to do. This is the episode, this is what you should do. Whereas it's much more reflective. So I'm coming up with a couple of takeaways that have resonated with me. You're doing the same. The guest is doing the same. And sometimes those takeaways are very similar and sometimes they're very different. And I think that's great. And then we obviously encourage our listeners to think about what their takeaway is, because it might be different again. But I think it is very empowering for people to be able to listen to a podcast, for it to be lighthearted and enjoyable, but also really informative, and then think, yeah, okay, I'm going to go and do this now. And that was something we were really keen to make sure we had in the show, that actually people could take stuff away and they could do it. They could do it within the next couple of hours or the next day or whatever it is. And so it's a really nice way to kind of finish up the show, I think. And it does take it full circle.
Do you know what I would have if I could wish for anything from the podcast? Not for anything in life. I'd have obviously loads of amazing things. But if I could wish for anything from the podcast, we say most weeks to our listeners, if you've got a different takeaway to us, if you've learned something from this show that we haven't picked up on, comment on that. Tell us about that. I don't think Spotify works in the same way as Instagram and Facebook, of the more comments feeds to the algorithm. It's not about making us famous and driving up engagement levels. We're genuinely interested to know, what are your takeaways from this conversation? What have you learned from this conversation? Because when we're in it, I think we see a certain amount of it. But when you're outside of that conversation listening to it, I think you're slightly more free to hear things that maybe Brad and I and the guest have missed. So, listeners, I would say to you, when we say, what are your takeaways, we want to know that as well. Because if they're different to ours, then we get to learn as well as you get to.
Yeah, cool. So we've discovered we've got an actual genius concept of a podcast.
Such a clever concept.
We've got two handsome hosts.
Handsome, and
guests are handsome too.
I mean, some of them have been devastatingly handsome, but that's by the by.
They have.
But hang on, wait. Wait. Not
I've not finished, you interrupting little
shut
fucker.
up. Not only are we handsome, were you going to say that we're also qualified to have these conversations?
I was
All
trying.
right, I'll shut up.
That's what I was going to
I'll
say.
be
I was
quiet.
trying.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you sit there and empathetically listen, you absolute weasel.
Actively listen.
So yeah, I was going to go on to that point that actually, we are qualified to be having these conversations. It's fun. I've said it about 3 times already, but I can't stress how important it is that the show is fun and it's lighthearted. So it's great. It's all there for you to listen to. If you're struggling with your mental health, then check it out. If you know someone who might be struggling with their mental health, check it out and then maybe send it to them. Where can people listen to it?
So Spotify is the main place that we push. That's where we share links from. But it is basically everywhere other than Apple Podcasts, because I still haven't worked out how to get it onto Apple. There's some complication with our Apple ID, but
not only because Spotify is great because you can listen to it if you just want to listen to it, if you're going somewhere and you're on the move, but all of our shows are filmed as well. So if you prefer to watch and see it all live unfolding before your very eyes, you can do that as well. So whatever works for you, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, any other platform, as I said, until Nibbo figures out
there's
how to crack Apple.
Casts, and there's let me see if I can find where the other ones are.
Ultimately, you need to look for mental health takeaways. You'll also find us on Instagram and on Facebook, so you can keep up with our socials. On there, you'll see little snippets of shows that have been and gone and up and come in, and it'll just give you a little bit of an insight. And you'll find links to show episodes as well.
The thing I wanted to finish on is the other Would You Rather, just to give our guests something to think about, because you can take this as deep or as light as you want to go. But Brad, maybe I ask you this question and then we cut. We never find out your answer. Would you rather, and I know you've thought about this before, eat chocolate that tastes like shit, so it is indistinguishable from human feces, looks like it, smells like it, feels like it, tastes like it, or actual poo that is indistinguishable from chocolate? It looks, smells, tastes just like chocolate, but it has come out of a human bumhole.
Well, that's easy. I would choose
I burped in a girl's face today.